So one of the most significant descriptions in the teaching is the description that says the human being on a biological and psychological level is essentially a biological instrument through which consciousness functions. And that means that in each moment, the human being is functioning exactly the way that it is designed to function, according to God's will, according to the predestined story of life, according to, if we prefer to use a causal explanation, the genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning the exact set of circumstances and everything that has come before that has put in place the makeup of the human being exactly the way it is. This means that we can start to observe, if this description starts to settle in, we can start to observe the human being as a vehicle through which biological and psychological reactions arise or happen. So we can see thoughts arising in a biological instrument, feelings arising in a biological instrument, emotions arising and falling in a biological instrument. This means that the identification with the thoughts as my thought, the feelings as my thought, starts to weaken as these movements, these behaviors, these functions happen on an ongoing basis as a happening based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So a thought arises within a body-mind organism. And if these thoughts are witnessed as happenings, then we might start to see the mechanical nature of thoughts and feelings, emotions. We might be able to see more easily not my doing, but a happening based on the circumstance I find myself in, and the body-mind organism's particular makeup. So at any point in time, the body-mind organism is one way, not multiple ways, but only one way in design. And that one way that it is finds itself in a particular circumstance, which is also just one way. And the combination of the circumstance plus the body-mind organism create a reaction, a movement. And I'm not using the word reaction as if it's a trigger, being triggered or psychological. It just means if someone asks a question, that's part of the circumstance that the body-mind organism finds themselves in, and there will be a reaction to the circumstance. So the circumstance includes the question, what is your name? There's a reaction. Why should I tell you? Or my name is Roger. Whatever the reaction happens to be. Not something that I'm in control of, but something that happens according to the particular makeup at that point in time and the circumstance we find ourselves in. This isn't about judging whether the reaction is positive or negative. It's about seeing that in any moment there are reactions that happen according to the circumstance we find ourselves in. And then we can break those reactions down into two categories. biological reactions, psychological reactions. The biological reactions are those reactions which happen according to the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and particularly up-to-date conditioning which we would call part of the working mind. So functional and not attitudinal. The psychological reaction is the reaction which is defined specifically as a reaction which is attitudinal to the flow of life. So the biological reaction could be one of fear arising because we're approached by a stranger. That fear is part of the biological reaction, and it's part of the circumstance. If we then have a reaction that judges our fear as something that we shouldn't have, then that reaction is what we can call psychological, because it is attitudinal to the circumstance. If we find ourselves taking an extra piece of chocolate, an extra piece of cake, an extra serving of food, that's part of the circumstance, and it's part of it, that movement towards the food is a biological reaction based on one's genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance we find ourselves in. The thinking mind can very often then kick in and judge the biological reaction as appropriate or inappropriate. Now, I'm not talking about discerning the biological reaction as appropriate or inappropriate. That discernment may well be part of the working mind, where we say, the working mind might say, actually, you've just taken a third serving. It's simply an observation. It hasn't turned it into a judgment like you're an invalid human being for taking a third serving. So that discernment of the working mind, the recognizing, oh, you've taken a third serving and someone hasn't even had one serving, that is a discernment, and it could then draw a conclusion and say, well, actually, now that I see the situation, that isn't ideal behavior, and still recognizing that it's not ideal relative to a certain benchmark. Relative to, and this is very important, relative to a specific benchmark, in this case of, let's say, social etiquette. Still all of this within the realm of the working mind. There hasn't been a judgment of oneself or the other as invalid as a result of the inappropriate behavior. As soon as the attitude to the circumstance becomes an attitude of personal doership, where we see that you should have acted differently, and you as a doer, as an independent entity that should know better and could have acted differently. And as a result of not acting differently and delivering pain rather than pleasure, delivering an outcome that is not ideal, are invalid. As soon as that kicks in, then that is an attitude to what is happening, that is an attitude of personal doership, and an attitude of attachment to outcomes, meaning having an idea of how life should look. And with that attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome, there is this layer of psychological reactions that accompany the biological reactions, which we can call part of the flow of life. So the biological reactions, including the working of the working mind, all part of the flow of life. The psychological reaction, part of the thinking mind, is based on a very specific type of up-to-date conditioning. The up-to-date conditioning which sees life as my doing and the doing of the other, and has an idea of how life should look, moment after moment after moment. That set of thinking we can call the psychological reaction, and it's based on a very particular set of beliefs. They're beliefs which we can say are essentially an idea of who we see ourselves to be and how we see life. They're beliefs that life itself has put in place. Beliefs that mean in that moment we're forced to respond with this psychological layer of doership, this attitude to the flow of life. So in the same way as the biological reaction in the moment is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that we're not in control of, the psychological reaction that adds a layer of uncomfortableness, a layer of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation on top of the flow of life, which is either pleasure or pain. That extra layer of judgment, uncomfortableness with oneself and the other, is also based on one's genes and up-to-date conditioning that we didn't put in place, and therefore that movement is as impersonal and as inevitable as the flow of life, as impersonal and inevitable as the biological reactions. The reason for creating a distinction is to make it very clear that on a biological level, on the level of the flow of life, the biological reactions are only ever pleasure or pain. So the flow of life as it unfolds is pleasure or pain. It's pleasure when the outcomes are in line with our biological preferences, and it's pain when the outcomes are not in line with our biological preferences. So if we go back to the example where there was hunger, we could say pain in the moment, and we're at a party and we see food on the table. And so there is a biological movement to fulfill the hunger by taking some food. That's pleasure in the moment, assuming the food is in line with your biological preferences. And then someone comes up and says, hey, I've been watching you and you're eating a lot of the food, and other people haven't even started eating yet. In fact, we haven't opened up the food table yet. And so this becomes part of the circumstance in the moment. And so we could say, according to our biological preferences, it's probably going to be that this is now pain in the moment. We've been told that we're not performing in line with the rules. And so we might acknowledge that, and it might be, pain in the moment. If we then add a layer of psychological suffering on top of that, psychological reaction, which is a judgment towards the person who told us that we're out of line, and we blame them for what they said, or we suddenly feel really ashamed and blame ourselves, then that becomes a layer on top of the pleasure or pain of the moment, additional to the pleasure or pain of the flow of life. So the pleasure or pain of the flow of life is inevitable. The load of suffering is attitudinal to the flow of life. However, it's not exactly optional. It too is based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that are there, and we will have to function according to the ingrained belief of who we are and what we need. And if that ingrained set of beliefs is such as tends to be the default that life puts in place, we're bound to blame the person who told us that we were out of line, or feel a layer of shame for having acted out of line. And that psychological reaction is based on the deeply ingrained idea that I could have acted differently. Now, when we think about it, we would say, well, of course, I could have acted differently. I could have had the thought that looked around and noticed that no one else was eating. I could have had the thought that said, hold on, your hunger can wait, and just be polite. I could have not reached out and grabbed the food. So, hypothetically, we could come up with the story that says I could have acted differently. Who's telling me I couldn't have acted any other way other than the way I acted? And if we left it at that, we might just walk away going, of course I was invalid. I should have acted better. But when we look at it more closely, we find that we act in each moment according to the very particular makeup that we have in that moment, and according to the very particular set of circumstances that exist in that moment. And it's hypothetical that we could have acted differently. We would have needed to be a different person. The circumstance would have needed to be different. And if we were a different person, or the circumstance was different, then we would have acted differently. And what keeps us not seeing this fact is the idea that we have of who we are. And that idea is that there is a me, which is this imaginary psychological entity that is meant to be a me that is in control of the psychological and biological movements of the human being. There is an idea that there is a me that determines when to eat and what to say and how to feel. And with this idea of ourself, that there is a me that magically decides of its own volition, unaffected by anything else. It really is a crazy notion when we look at it, that there is, I'm going to shake my head again. I can understand until we see the dynamics, until we are conditioned to really look at what drives the movement of the human being, then it makes sense that we'll run with whatever seems to be the most reasonable explanation. And what seems to be the most reasonable explanation is that there is an independent me. Independent means unaffected, not connected to anything else. Independent. The word volition can be used to describe the choosing power of this independent entity. And it's this independent entity that says, okay, now this is what you're going to say. This is how you're going to feel. This is what you are thinking. I'm creating the thought in this moment, which is going to create the movement that you're going to do next. That's what seems to be ingrained as the assumption of what drives human behavior in each moment, both psychological and biological movements. But when we look at it and we try to find this psychological me, it just doesn't exist, because all of the movements that are attributed to this psychological me are mechanical. They happen because of different mechanisms. They happen as a result of a different movement in life, not the moment-to-moment creation of life by a particular independent entity, but rather by the functioning of this movement of life, which is much grander than we tend to realize. And so when we look for this me, we don't find one, because the movements that are attributed to the me are actually handled and created by something completely different. It's created by a biological instrument that is not separate from the past, is essentially shaped by how life impacted the genetic structure moment after moment after moment. And life impacting the genetic structure effectively is creating the human being and how they are on a biological and psychological level, creating that so that it is that way in each moment. So the thinking is simply not a result of an independent doer. And as this becomes observed, understood, based on an observation of our own experience, something that we recognize, I think this way because my parents have encouraged this sort of thinking. It was a priority that they instilled in me. So that's part of the conditioning that was delivered moment after moment in the family environment. That it's very important to work hard and create financial security for yourself. That we can see is part of the parents' makeup, something that is encouraged, so new conditioning that adds to the up-to-date conditioning. And then we see that when we approach life with a particular bent towards working hard. And as we observe this, it's not a judgment. I mean, it might actually be a very noble way of seeing life. The point here is not to judge it, but to see, oh yes, I have this inclination to work hard because I've been designed by life to be this way. So the more and more that we see that in each moment, whatever I do is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And life is delivering new conditioning moment after moment, and that new conditioning adds to my up-to-date conditioning. And so new conditioning can radically change my up-to-date conditioning, or it can just add to the existing themes. So a recognition of this dynamic starts to undermine the belief in a me doer, a me that is separate and independent. And we start to see that what I thought was a me is actually the functioning of a biological instrument. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper, eventually becoming total, meaning that it makes complete sense and it's been seen, not just understood intellectually, but seen over and over and over again, how every little movement, including the smallest of thought, the smallest of feeling, the smallest of behavioral patterns, can be attributed to a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that the individual has never been in control of. We weren't in control of the genes we were born with. We didn't choose the parents we were conceived to or by. We didn't choose which country we were born into and which religious ideals were in place, what the political system was, what school we went to, what friends we made, what values were instilled in us in the home. All of these were consequential. And we were shaped by these factors. only these two factors. And when this becomes really known and seen, the alternative simply doesn't make sense. The old way of seeing it doesn't make sense. And the psychological me, the doer, and the associated load of guilt and blame and pride, expectation and worry that was carried around for a whole lifetime on the basis that what happened through me, what happened through the other, was a result of a separate independent entity that should have been better. That what happened through the other was their doing, and that they should have and could have done it differently, and that they did it this way, and it's personal. And so when we see life like this, the other is a competitor, they're a rival, they're an enemy. And I am continually going to judge myself as being appropriate or not appropriate as a human being, depending on the outcomes that are delivered through my actions. And hence, this idea of who I am, this false belief, it turns out, is the very basis on which this load of guilt, blame and pride, worry and expectation stands. And should life bring about a seeing, and in an instant, because we can hear this notion and understand it intellectually, and in an instant we might really get what is being said. And we might exclaim, I simply cannot be the doer. I've never been the doer. The other has never been the doer. The other was just an instrument through which destiny was being delivered. I am just an instrument through which destiny is unfolding. That event that I interpreted so personally, the event where I felt I was absolutely being personally attacked by the actions of the other, the event that I interpreted as being a complete failure based on my inability as a human being. They were all happenings as part of the story of life, not my doing and not the other's doing. We're all in this together, all characters in the game of life, functioning exactly as we're destined to function, functioning in each moment exactly the way we are designed to function. And it's not personal. So in an instant, the recognition, I simply cannot be the doer, can happen. If it happens, it's also not my doing, but a realization that happens as a result of the adjusting of the up-to-date conditioning. So, why is there all this talk about non-doership and an explanation of what, on a biological and psychological level, the human being is, i.e. a biological instrument through which consciousness is functioning? The reason this is all explained is for a very simple reason, and that is that what we're really seeking, when we drop all other ideas of what it is that we're looking for, when we exhaust all other avenues, we'll come to the conclusion, actually all I'm looking for is to be happy. All I'm looking for is happiness in this life for Roger. And the happiness that we realize that we're looking for is not a happiness in the form that we've been seeking it. We realize I'm never going to be happy on a continuous, unbroken basis through circumstance being the way I would like it. we realize the happiness that I'm really looking for, the happiness that satisfies, is happiness through peace of mind, meaning happiness through the end of suffering. And suffering, as I have described, is always attitudinal and not circumstantial. So we're looking for the end of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome that adds a layer of uncomfortableness on top of the pleasure and pain of life. So we might get to realize that the flow of life is always going to be either pleasure or pain. Nothing that we can do about that. So hoping for life to one day be pleasure, 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 pleasure. Hoping that the other will always do what we like. That our actions will always deliver a positive outcome. Hoping that when I go to the shopping center, I'm going to find a parking spot right outside the front door. And that when I go to the shops, the products that I want are all going to be on special. They're never going to be out of stock. That the movies I go and see are going to be given a 10 out of 10 by me, because they're the perfect movie. And that if I go surfing, all the waves are going to be brilliant. And that I'm never going to sprain my ankle or miss a bus or a plane. I'm never going to buy the wrong product. I'm going to act perfectly in all situations, never say anything stupid. You know, this would be hoping for life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. And the nature of life is simply not that. The nature of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. The outcomes are not in our control. It will be pleasurable when the outcome is in line with our biological preference, painful when the outcome is not in line with our biological preference. So by all means, let's do what we can, let's do our best in each situation to attempt for the best outcome. But sooner or later we have to realize that having done our best, the outcome is simply not in our control. Sometimes we get what we want, and sometimes we don't. And Ramesh used to say that sometimes we get much more than what we want. So having surrendered to the fact that the flow of life on a circumstantial level is always going to be pleasure or pain, we might realize, the happiness that I'm really looking for is never to be found in circumstance. It's not a happiness that equates to pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. It's happiness through peace of mind, which means an attitude of acceptance. And acceptance isn't actually something that we do. We don't do accepting. We don't have to apply ourselves moment after moment to accept life. We don't have to work hard at accepting. Accepting is the very fundamental nature of who we are when non-accepting isn't functioning. So acceptance is what's there when non-acceptance has fallen away. Non-acceptance falls away when it becomes clear that my aim to control life is futile. That life is going to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others, and therefore when life does deliver pain, it's not seen as if life has suddenly broken, that the universe has stopped working because pain has been delivered. It's not seen that a friend has let us down, and that simply doesn't equate to interhuman relationships. It's understood, yes, this is part of the flow of life. And so if it's understood, it can be allowed and accepted. Non-acceptance tends to happen when we have an attitude towards life that is an attitude of expecting it to look a certain way. Expecting it to always fall in line with my preferences. Expecting my actions to be perfect. Expecting the other to be perfect. So the Buddha has said enlightenment is the end of suffering. And the cause of suffering is desire. And the cause of desire is attachment. So that, in summary for me, that little quote early on, and I loved deductive statements. One thing leads to another. It allows us to understand, because it all needs to make sense. That to me was really important at highlighting what is it that I'm really looking for? What is this enlightenment that is being spoken about? Because often it is described from many different angles, many of them using a lot of superlatives, a lot of colorful adjectives. I remember coming across a description at one point saying that your true nature is brighter than the light of 1 billion suns. And at that point, I had sort of landed on the fact, okay, what this is about is coming to understand my true nature that I don't know. I have forgotten my true nature. And here's the description: your true nature is brighter than the light of 1 billion suns. I thought, I've got to know this. This is who I am. Anyway, that's just, there's a purpose for that. It basically, it's sort of like divine marketing. Gets you hooked, gets you interested in searching for this I that I am, that I've forgotten or overlooked. Oh, and by the way, it's brighter than the light of 1 billion suns. I thought, yep, I'll sign up for that one. I liked solving problems and riddles, and so this seemed like a pretty good riddle to spend some time on. Anyway, along the way, I valued coming across some much simpler and quantifiable explanations. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. The cause of desire is attachment. So let's look at this. Desire is the desire for outcomes. So the cause of suffering is wanting life, desiring life to be a particular way. Why do we desire life to be a particular way? The reason, according to this little statement, is attachment. So what does attachment mean? Attachment really, when we break it down, means the deeply ingrained belief about who we are that includes the notion that I'm not complete until life delivers certain things. So attachment means the idea that I will be complete with X, Y, and Z. So, and along with that, that if X, Y, and Z are not delivered or are taken away, then I am less complete. So attachment basically means my completeness is dependent on outcomes. If I have an idea that my completeness is dependent on, let's say, finding the perfect soulmate, that's my belief. My completeness, who I am, will be complete when I find perfect soulmate. I'm going to then have the consequence of that belief, which is a craving for that outcome. That's desire. A craving for a particular outcome based on the deeper ingrained belief that that outcome will complete me, will add to who I am. And with that belief and that craving, we hope and insist that life turns out a particular way. The fact of the matter is, life will turn out as it's destined to turn out, not as we would expect it to turn out. And as a result of having this insistence, this expectation, this craving for a particular outcome, when it's not delivered, there is an uncomfortableness with life. And more particularly, the uncomfortableness with life is usually an uncomfortableness with the other or with oneself. Both aspects of life. The other and oneself aspects of life. When the other does something that hurts me, not in line with my desire, then I have to hate the other for essentially, according to my belief system, attacking who I am by delivering pain and not pleasure. If I do something that doesn't deliver the outcomes that I'm looking for, I see that as an attack on myself, by myself. So I feel shame, guilt. So enlightenment is just the ending of this attitude towards life, an attitude where we desire outcomes based on a belief that what I am will be completed when I get certain outcomes. How does this desire fall away? It falls away when an inquiry happens. The inquiry can be twofold. One, into the nature of suffering, where we see the dynamics of suffering. We see that there is a false sense of self, a small self-image that gets created based on these beliefs of what I need and who I am. Essentially, in this teaching, we're saying that that false identity is known as the doer belief, the belief that I am the doer of what happens and the other is the doer of what happens, and that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. So the inquiry can look at the dynamics of suffering and start to see the fallacies, start to see that the interpretation of myself as the doer is not that accurate. And on the other hand, we might start to bump into an aspect of the human being, an aspect of ourself that has been overlooked because the attention has been pointed outward, pointed towards outcomes. Often a desire, a craving for outcomes that include love between oneself and the other, because that's our ingrained definition of completion, which means we're looking for ourself out there. And so as that starts to be diminished, we might find that we start getting glimpses of what we really are. And we find it has nothing to do with approval from the other. It has nothing to do with outcomes in the future. We might start landing on the fact that, I always have been. I always have been valid. Even when society was telling me I'm not valid. Even when I was functioning in a way that, according to certain benchmarks, definitely wasn't positive. And yet, even with that biological functioning at my root, the essence of who I am is the same as the essence of Mother Teresa or the Dalai Lama or any saint that has lived. The essence of the saint and the essence of the psychopath, the fundamental essence is the same. And what drives a psychopath to be a psychopath is a disconnection from that core essence, not knowing oneself, having a false self-image develop, a belief that life needs to unfold a particular way. And when life doesn't turn out that way, it's seen as an attack on that self-image. That self-image becomes bitter. The self-image becomes disempowered. The self-image starts to hate the other, hate itself. And the consequence of that is a general attitude of suspicion and rivalry and hatred towards life and towards the other. And that attitude starts to play itself out in a biological form. Or should I say, in play itself out in behavior and in actions. But fundamentally, beneath that, the self, the consciousness functioning through the human being, is the same as that functioning through a saint. And a recognition of that, which could happen at any moment, can bring about a collapse in that psychological entity that has come to exist, can bring about a collapse in the load of guilt and blame, load of hatred and shame, load of pride. And so if we bump into that essence more and more frequently and realize, I can relax and allow life to be as it is because I already am, I already exist. I don't exist as a saint or a psychopath. I exist as the essence of the human being. And so as we rest there more and more often, it becomes known that actually happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Completeness isn't to be found in circumstance. And so that craving, that desire, based on a deeply ingrained attachment, starts to become weaker and weaker. So what we're looking for, going back to this search and keeping it very practical, what we're really looking for is happiness in the form it's available. Happiness through peace of mind, meaning happiness because of the end of suffering. And why is that happiness available? It's available for one reason that we can describe in two ways. One, that the core of the human being is already complete and at peace, and therefore can be at peace with life as it unfolds, regardless of the circumstance, knowing that circumstance is just pleasure or pain and doesn't add or subtract from what I am at my core. The other reason it's available, which is another way of explaining it, is that the false self-image, the false idea of who I am as primarily just a physical, biological human being, believing itself to be separate and independent, not connected to anything, turns out to be false, turns out to be an error. And therefore, if that idea of oneself is an error, and that idea of oneself is the basis on which the suffering arises, it makes sense that in the same way that life put the error in place, life can correct the error. If the error gets corrected, the subsequent errors that were stemming from that original error will cease. If the error remains in place, then the suffering continues. So to know that the suffering is based on a false idea of who I am is great news. We can then start to relate to the suffering as not our true nature. This doesn't mean that we resist it. If we resist what is happening, if we resist suffering, which is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, then the doer is coming in again and not understanding why this is happening. To the extent that we understand, suffering is happening because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. However, suffering is not a result, not a manifestation of my true nature. My true nature is not uncomfortable with itself. The feeling that there is when suffering is that there is a uncomfortableness with oneself. So knowing that suffering is an error, not my true nature, doesn't mean we need to resist it. It just means we need to understand it as such. That understanding it as such, not my true nature, but rather something based on a false belief, allows us to investigate what is the belief. And if we're lucky, we've got some descriptions. The belief is that you require outcomes to be a certain way. You require the other to value you, to respect you, to treat you well, to consider you, to be honest with you. All of these shoulds and shouldn'ts. Now, it's true that if the other understands you, respects you, is honest with you, is kind to you, that's all very pleasurable. It's part of the flow of life. So I would like the other to be honest with me, to understand me, to respect me, to be kind. I would like that. And when it happens, it's very much appreciated as part of the flow of life. However, when it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that it is received as an indication that I am not valid. It doesn't get turned into a proof that I am incomplete. It's part of destiny for the other to ignore me. That's pain in the moment. And as long as I'm not receiving my sense of self-worth from the prompts of the other, I can rest in my own knowing of myself. I can even recognize that in a particular moment I didn't necessarily function in a way that is pleasant to the other, and that might be why the other is angry with me. So I can discern all of that, and yet rest in the fact that that was a happening, part of the unfolding of life, and I exist now, complete. If I'm relying on the prompts of the other to determine whether I'm valid or not, then my sense of completeness, my sense of self is very fragile, at the whim of the behavior of the other. If someone isn't talking to me, I guess I'm going to go around wondering, why are they not talking to me? And then that why are they not talking to me might turn into, I'm sure that I've done something wrong, and that for as long as it remains unrectified, I'm invalid. Which means we'll spend a lot of energy trying to be validated by the other. And often we're validated by the other when we deliver pleasure to the other. So all of our efforts are going to go into being a pleasure provider for the other in order to be validated. And if that stops, we get to be authentic, And I guess that's when we get to know ourself beyond the image of ourself, the image that feels fragile. So we live in a world of where the belief in doership is very strong. So the other is always going to tell us what's wrong. And they're going to tell us that you're wrong because you didn't do this. And we're going to believe them until it starts to occur to us that, oh, that's a story coming from the belief of who they are. A belief that they are someone that is incomplete until the other behaves a certain way. Which means there's a strong desire for the other to deliver pleasure. And therefore when the other doesn't, automatically there's going to be a judgment and an accusation. You know, I forgive you, but just so you know, this is what you did wrong. And then, oh, thanks for forgiving me. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And we feel like we need to improve. So for as long as we believe the story, then I guess we could say we're just perpetuating the false idea that life has embedded in us. That's why we believe the story. At some point, we can start standing a little more independent from these stories. Someone will tell us, you know, you're not really paying me enough attention. I'm not sure that you're fulfilling your friendship duties. And you can hear that. And you might even agree. You'd say, it's true, I've been very busy the last few months. But I don't believe that this makes me invalid as a human being. I don't even believe that my lack of attention towards you makes you any less invalid. So we come to see both myself and the other as complete prior to outcomes. And so if we find, yes, I did function in a particular way that did deliver pain to the other, we can apologize for that. I'm sorry for having delivered an outcome that was painful to you. Not my intention. But that apology is not an apology where we see that that outcome has diminished the other person as a human being, has attacked them on the level of self. If we see that, we're going to feel guilty down to a very deep level because I've attacked someone at the level of self. I've diminished them. And if I see the other like that, I see myself like that. If I stop seeing myself dependent on outcomes, then I can start owning to some extent, yes, I apologize for my action that wasn't in line with your preference. Not my intention to hurt you, but it happened. It happened because I had to honor, let's say, something I wanted to do. I didn't realize it was going to hurt you. But now I don't see their fate as a human being, their completeness, dependent on how I on what I deliver. This is actually freedom for oneself and freedom towards the other. If we continue to validate that my actions, which are outcomes in the flow of life, actually affect them on the level of self, on the level of them being complete or incomplete, I'm codependent in their false sense of self. And that doesn't help me, because if I'm codependent in their false sense of self, I'm reinforcing the same false idea about myself. So to stand up and to step out of this codependent wheel and say, no, your completeness is not dependent on how I treat you. By all means, if I treat you in a way that is not pleasurable to you, by all means make a decision that you don't think that we should carry on in the same relationship status. That, to me, makes sense. What you're doing is not in line with my preferences. It's not pleasurable, and I'd like to make a change. But don't insist that that is an attack on who you are. And to the extent that you can't help but insist that my behavior is an attack on who you are, I understand that you can't do it any differently, but I'm not going to buy into it. And stepping out of that pattern is the best thing we can do for someone, best thing we can do for ourselves. To accept anger as a biological reaction, to accept sadness as a biological reaction, to accept that as part of the human expression of emotions, and to not put restrictions on ourselves, to allow ourselves to be much more authentically, is very important. It's starting to loosen our attachment to outcomes, because anger, when it arises, is painful as a biological reaction. It's not pleasant. The circumstance that inspires the anger is usually a circumstance that is not pleasant, and then the anger that arises is not pleasant. And it's an attachment to pleasure that has created a sort of a suppression of certain ways of functioning. So we want to try and control ourselves so that life is much more pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That's just supporting this false idea of oneself. It's maintaining a notion that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. That's why we're trying to suppress certain ways of functioning. And in doing that, we're just strengthening the false belief, increasing the disconnection with oneself. So at some point it's like, actually, I've had enough of trying to control who I am on a biological level. Let it be what it's going to be. And as I mentioned this morning, we might be surprised at what that ends up looking like once we surrender. The thinking mind will say, if you surrender to letting yourself be whatever you happen to be, that's going to be disastrous. You're going to be shouting at everyone. At some point, the controlling becomes felt and known to be a disconnection from your true nature. And it's at that point that we surrender and say, I've had enough of this. I've had enough of maintaining this false belief, a belief that keeps me separate from my true nature, and my true nature is what we're really looking for. My true nature is the peace, is the equanimity with life, is the equanimity with the pleasure and pain. Save me, someone.
So any sort of validation you get from your partner could be categorized under pride?
No, the validation, well, if depends. So any outcome that is pleasurable, that is delivered by your partner to you, can be received as pleasure. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with pleasure itself. The problem is our attachment to pleasure, where we feel dependent on pleasure, which then means we demand it. We feel like we need it. It's like oxygen. And if it's not there, we feel deprived of oxygen. We feel like something is missing. And then when it comes, it's like, thank you. Thank you for giving me what I need. And so if we end up having a relationship where we are craving validation, i.e. craving pleasure in the form of you are so good, let's say, and we are relating to that pleasure in an unhealthy way, meaning in a way where we feel added to or subtracted from, that's what's important, is our attitude to how the partner treats us. So by all means, receive the pleasure and enjoy it. If you see that it's something you're essentially strategizing to get more and more of, not just for the pleasure of it, but for the sense of self of it, then that recognition is a great recognition, because it's a seeing of the structure that's being described here as your false sense of self, the structure that keeps us disconnected from that which we truly are, which is the most natural resting in being nothing in particular. What a relief. I can sit down at any point in time on the couch, close my eyes and rest, and just be nothing in particular. If someone is talking to me and I really deep down feel like not answering, I can be that not answering and be completely valid. Rest in a being that doesn't require me to be anything in particular. In fact, demands me to be whatever I am in that moment, without judgment, without prerequisites or expectation. That means that we can be in the middle of a big project, and if the drive is to just stop because it's all too much, we could stop and allow ourselves to be the one that's stopped, the one that can't go any further. And if we don't have a judgment of what that means about me, relative to some expectation of how I perform, then I can rest in the fact that I, in this moment, am destined to be, am meant to be, the one that stops. Like, that is what God is asking of me. To be and to do what is authentic in that moment. So if I were to have to stop, if I were, let's say, sick and couldn't go on, the thinking mind would kick in and go, this is not at all how it's meant to look. I want to be able to finish this. I never finish what I start, let's say. And that's an attitude to the situation. Whereas if we could speak with God and say, God, what do you want me to do? And he'd say, you're doing it. That's what I want of you. And the thinking mind might say, what, you want me to be a failure? He said, no, I don't. I just want you to stop, if that's what is authentic. So there is this place inside of us that we can rest in once the thinking mind that says how we should and shouldn't be falls away. And it's self-confirming, it's self-validating. This is the beauty, is that it doesn't require validation from outside. It already is. It's a causeless peace. It's not a peace from anything. We can't, when we rest there and we find the peace, we don't find it's because of anything circumstantial. So then we come to the conclusion, what I am is peace. It's a causeless peace, or a self-fulfilling peace.
So if it is our tendency in relationship to validate ourselves through pleasure, and there's a scene of that, is then there could be a movement of almost starving yourself of that pleasure, or just not engaging in those patterns?
How the habit gets cut off is varied. One of the ways is through renunciation, which for a while sort of treats the pleasure as the problem, whereas actually it's the attachment to the pleasure that's the problem. The renunciation basically says, my relationship to pleasure is so intertwined that essentially the pleasure is the problem. That put the pleasure and me together and it's a problem. And so it's akin to, going cold turkey. Renunciation is, I don't need that pleasure in order to be complete. And therefore, I am going to push that pleasure away. And so a monk that renounces worldly life, renounces a lot of worldly pleasure, and at some point, walking through the forest, the sun shining through the trees, the smell of the overnight rain, everything's crisp, and he has this sense of presence and a sense of, complete existence in a full, nothing missing way. Like, I am. Like, wow, I am. And the working mind might actually go, I am, and I don't have hair. And I haven't had sex in whatever number of years or months, or and no good food, just boiled rice, hard bed, cold showers, and I am. And I don't need any of that in order to be. I exist in the absence. So the renunciation is simply process that in the end proves to us that your essence as a human being is there regardless of all of these trimmings. And so if we're not convinced of that, which is exactly the situation I'm suggesting, is that we have a deeply ingrained that I will only be complete when I have more and more trimmings. So if that's our idea of ourselves, at some point renunciation is maybe the mechanism, the methodology by which the attachment is broken. And maybe it doesn't require a starvation. Maybe it can happen just through observing the movements of the body towards pleasure, and seeing that it's not just a biological movement towards pleasure, but a psychological movement. And so the observing of those patterns may actually be enough to weaken the dynamic. And at some point, whether it's through a process of renunciation or a process of just seeing and transcending those desires and seeing that they'll never fulfill me, they haven't fulfilled me, and I'm just seeking more and more of the same sort of pleasure. So either way, at the end, we will hopefully be able to relate to pleasure in a healthy way, which means, say, bring it on. If life is going to include pleasure in the moment, I'll enjoy it fully. I'll see it as my destiny for pleasure to be here, knowing that it is temporary, knowing that it will end, not worrying about what will happen when it ends, who will I be when it ends. Life is not going to be as satisfying when it ends. And that's why in some of the scriptures and the Vedas, an enlightened being is referred to as a Mahabhogi, a super enjoyer. And in the same scriptures, an unenlightened person who is attached to outcomes, believes that their sense of self is to be found when they have more and more positive circumstance, they are known as a bhogi. So an enjoyer here meaning an enjoyer seeking completion in pleasure. So that's the unenlightened person, a bhogi. And then in the same context, the enlightened person is a mahabhogi, a super enjoyer. Maha means super enjoyer. So you'd think that that's odd. The unenlightened person is a bhogi. You'd think if someone was a mahabhogi, they're super unenlightened. But in fact, it means it's saying that the enlightened person is a mahabhogi, a super enjoyer. And why that is because the attachment has been transcended. And so now the relationship to pleasure is no longer one of trying to extract and then being worried about what's going to happen when it ends and not being able to fully enjoy it. Because before it even comes to an end, we're forecasting and projecting into the future, like, oh no, my holiday is up in 3 days' time. I've only been on holiday for 7 days have passed, and I've only got another 3 days to go. And so for the next 3 days, the enjoyment of those 3 days is interrupted by this projecting into the future. Whereas the liberated person gets to enjoy the pleasure fully, knowing it will end when it ends. Knowing that when it ends, it's just part of the flow of life. And it will be replaced by a new pleasure or pain, which in turn will also end. And if that connection to self is there, then there is a lowest common denominator, a fallback, that is a fallback that is more than enough. And so the circumstance becomes irrelevant, except irrelevant but unavoidable. So there, enjoy the pleasure when it's there. Endure the pain when it's there. Knowing that neither of which, pleasure or pain, is defining who you are.